In this video, I'm going to show you the best cinematic slow motion settings for the EOS R so you can get the most out of your next project. We're going to go over the settings, how to shoot it, and then some of the editing techniques in Premiere Pro that you can use to get the most out of this footage that you've just shot. So let's roll the clip that's going to be used as an example. Let's go. What is going on? My name is Daniel and welcome back to the channel where we go everything mirrorless Canon cameras. The last clip that you just saw was a short clip from a intro that I shot for another YouTuber here in Helsinki. We're going to be using it as an example. Everything in there was shot at 60 frames a second, and let's get into it. First off, cinematic is not settings, sadly. It is only a style. It makes things look like they're three-dimensional using a two-dimensional format. This means having good dynamic range, having midground, foreground, and background that are all moving in conjunction to give it a layered look. This also means having contrast of colors between different things so that one image looks like it's pulling away from everything else so that it feels three-dimensional. So before I get into the do's and don'ts of 60 frames a second with the EOS R, and generally most cameras, I'm going to give you the settings that you're going to need to get the most dynamic range out of the EOS R, and it's going to be 8-bit C-Log or 10-bit if you have an external recorder. It's going to give you the most dynamic range, and then you're going to want to switch it over to 60 frames a second. You are also capable of shooting in 120, but it will be in 720p, which is not ideal for getting wonderful quality and that cinematic look, but it can be useful for some situations. So if you go into Canon C-Log settings, this is where you're going to get the most dynamic range, and this is going to mimic what cinema cameras have, which is a high dynamic range, which means it has more colors between black and white to show you, meaning that shadows are going to be more gradual. There's going to be so much more highlights retained and details in the shadows. So if you go into the red camera number 4, and then about the 5th one down is going to be Canon log settings. Go into there, turn on 8-bit or 10-bit if you have an external recorder. You're going to be able to, I use View Assist, that is a personal preference. It allows you to see a lot better. Then in color matrix, I go to neutral rather than the cinematic EOS original because I find that it gives you much greater, your ability to pull colors and push them around is so much greater in post in neutral. And then characteristics, I use 4 strength or 5 depending on how strong I actually want the sharpness to be, saturation at 0 and hue at 0, and I find that these settings allow you to be able to once again push everything where you want it to in post. Another key characteristic is that you're going to need to hit is the white balance before you do it, so just go and set the white balance in the exact same menu before you start shooting. Otherwise it always looks a little bit off in post if your white balance isn't correct. Then for movie quality settings, you're going to go to the red camera number 1, the first option, movie size quality, and you're going to press on the 59.94 and hit OK. Then you're going to go back into your regular menu. This is going to give you the highest frame rate that you can shoot at while still retaining all of the features and 1080p in this camera. If you are stuck at 50 frames a second, there's a video right there that is about 30 seconds long that will show you how to be able to access all the frame rates. You're on PAL rather than NTSC, and you need to go and switch that. Next settings that you're going to need to be able to switch is your shutter speed. If you are shooting at 60, the word to the wise is shoot at double that, so 120. I prefer shooting at 160 to get a little bit less motion blur. Then to get the most dynamic range, you're going to want to shoot at exactly 400 ISO. This will give you the most retention of detail in your highlights and your shadows, which is kind of what you're going for here as cinematic looks. Now, before I show you exactly how to edit this footage that you're going to get, I'm going to go over some real don'ts of shooting in 60 frames a second. If you are trying to shoot an entire thing or part of it is going to be regular time motion, you're going to want to switch back into 24 or 23.8 so that the motion blur is accurate. If you shoot in 60 frames a second at the shutter speed of 120, you are going to have a lack of motion blur, or when you play them back at regular speed in 24 frames a second, because you're going to be missing half of that motion blur, which is half of the cinematic effect. So if you're shooting something at normal speed, make sure to switch your settings back to 24 or 23.89. Another don't is don't underexpose. I know you should be sticking to about 400 ISO, but underexposing footage will leave it with a ton of grain in post, which is the opposite of, well, hopefully the opposite of the effect you're trying to look for in cinematic. Most people, for skin tones, will expose about a half stop above what they're looking for. Alright, so back to the computer, I'm going to show you how to edit this footage that you've just shot. Some of the things, like I said, to make sure that before shooting is trying to look for contrast, textures, and just making three-dimensional movement within your images. So I'm going to show you the video one more time in straight C-Log out of the camera. None of it has been edited yet, and you'll see that it is very flat and needs to be have that contrast. So when you're pulling down the speed of these clips, you're going to want to pull it to about 40% slower, and that's going to give you the almost exact frame rate as 24 frames a second. What you're going to want to do, we're just going to edit this first little bit there where it's his hand, the white, and the grain right there. So the contrast comes from the textures and the bag, his hand, and the rock all being different colors. So if you come in here, you're going to go to basic auto correction. You're going to want to do the exposure first so that you can end up, because your exposure, if you switch everything else and then you adjust your exposure, it's going to change your colors. Once again, so I'm going to boost the contrast right in there, and that's where it makes it look. I'm actually going to pull that almost all the way to 100, and then I'm going to boost the highlights a little bit and bring the shadows down even more. And then I'm going to go into creative and boost the vibrance and a little bit of sharpen. And then for this, I kind of want a yellowish tint to it all. So we're going to put a little bit of yellow into the shadows. I think there's a little bit too much red in his hand, so I'm going to go over to these curves and adjust accordingly by just pulling it down ever so slightly. Coming over to the next one is going to have pretty much the exact same settings applied to it. And then this one right here is a little bit tricky because the last bit is a little bit tricky because the sky was so overexposed in comparison to what he was. I really needed an ND filter to shoot this, but I didn't have one on hand. So I'm actually going to change, make it a little bit cooler, and then bring the exposure ever so slightly up. And then I'm going to actually drop the highlights a little bit and take down the shadows and then the whites as well, while adding my contrast. That's going to give us about where I'm going to leave it. I would do a fade to white in this since it's already so exposed, but I'm going to leave it there so you can just see how it works through the entire thing. A little bit of sharpness and adding that yellow. I'm going to add a little bit more on this one than on the others, simply because it's also it wasn't shot with completely correct settings. And that pretty much wraps up the best cinematic settings to get slow motion out of the EOS R. I hope this video helped you out. If it did, don't forget to like and subscribe,